Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today, our 78th episode. Hard to imagine that time has flown by like that. Friday, October 8th. I'm so glad to be with you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend lined up and we get to send you off to that weekend today with a little bit of news about COVID, a little bit of things from our mailbox. We're going to talk today, if I can get a screen share up here. Again, it was really well received the last time we did this, our From the Mailbox feature, which we're going to start to do more regularly. Common MedTech startup questions. We get questions all the time. Some of them are explicit and some of them are implicit from our clients and from folks that we're talking to. And we're bringing those back to you in a way that obviously isn't identifying who asked it, but is getting to the heart of some things that startups, MedTech startups, wrestle with. And so we'll be talking about that again in just a minute with a whole new slate of questions. Feel free to bring your questions out today. We are happy to field those live. If it sparks something in you, it says, hey, I'm not quite sure about that. Let's unpack that. It's always fun to do. We had some great interaction the last time we did that. But first up, COVID Connect, COVID metrics and vaccine distribution. Our data, as always, coming from cdc.gov. But before we get to the CDC data, I want to share with you this from the New York Times that came across my desk. They're not denying COVID, don't get that wrong. It's a bit of a grab headline there. The COVID fable, when we treat COVID as a simple morality play, that goes for either quote unquote side of this, we can end up making bad predictions. This article by David Leonard, recommend to your reading, share just a little bit with you here. In the final weeks of this summer, with COVID-19 cases soaring, many people assumed the pandemic was on the verge of getting worse. He starts it out. Kids going back to classrooms, football stadiums filling back up. The Delta variant, all the predictions were this is going to get so much worse. Here we go. The Washington Post cited an estimate that daily caseloads could reach 300,000 in August, higher than ever before. And David's point is, that's exactly not what happened. In fact, what he's been tracking for the last while is that COVID seems to follow this weird, and this is, again, he says, simply an observation of the data. This isn't causal. He's not explaining a causality. He just says, it seems like every 2 months, this thing goes through a cycle. And his punchline, I'll let you read it for yourself, obviously, vaccinations, other measures when caseloads are high, because that's the only reasonable response. But as he says, a large dose of humility, which we certainly need for unity around here. But generally, good news nationwide. Specific states may be different. So we'll take a look at Michigan in just a second. Also, we've had questions in previous weeks about how do hospitalizations track with vaccination status? That is a big question. I think we've talked about the point many times that CDC has declined to track, for example, breakthroughs. They've declined to track natural infection, natural immunity versus vaccination versus unaffected, never before touched by the virus. So we're again dealing with incomplete data. But we do the best that we can, and this from the CDC, as of September 17th, the revised version of the report, the first one they had to correct. New COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations among adults by vaccination status, New York. So we're back in the US finally. We've been talking about Israel data in previous weeks. New York from May 3rd through July 25th. Now, May 3rd, we were coming down, at least in New York, out of a wave. And by July 25th, we were coming into a wave. It would be really interesting to see what this data has done in July and August and September. But nevertheless, it's statewide data for the state of New York, a state that has done a pretty good job getting its population vaccinated. And let's take a look at some of this. I think it's instructive, somewhat inconclusive, but instructive. On May 3rd, the state of New York had about as many fully vaccinated people as it had unvaccinated people, about 6 million in each camp. They didn't include those who were partially vaccinated. So the full vaccination coverage comes out to about 40%. And again, an omission from the study. They just didn't count the people who are partially vaccinated. By July 19th, these numbers had changed somewhat. It looks like a lot of the partially vaccinated folks, had become fully vaccinated. And it looks like some of the unvaccinated folks had become fully vaccinated. So we end up with 10 million fully vaccinated, and we end up with 4.5 million unvaccinated. Okay, that's a neat window to be looking at because we went from about a 50-50 split to now about, roughly 2-to-1 vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And it's worth noting that, first of all, we're going to talk about new cases. The fully vaccinated columns, when compared to the unvaccinated columns, both in raw numbers and in the rate, are lower. Full stop. The raw numbers and the rate, those numbers for the fully vaccinated are lower for new cases. The same is true for hospitalizations. Those who are fully vaccinated accounted for a lower count of hospitalizations, new hospitalizations, as well as a lower rate of new hospitalizations than those who were unvaccinated. What gets interesting, though, and this I don't think we have answers for today, but it's worth just asking the question. In terms of new cases, the number of new cases on May 3rd was 685 for those fully vaccinated and 8,853 for those unvaccinated. Pretty compelling. Same with hospitalizations, 157 count for those who are vaccinated and nearly 10 times as many for those who are unvaccinated. That makes a pretty compelling argument back in May. What's strange to me, though, is that by the time we get to July 19th, we've nearly doubled the number of vaccinated persons. And now we're getting, in July, nearly 3,000 new cases among the vaccinated, while the cases among the unvaccinated has dropped. And in new hospitalizations, we're getting about the same count as we were getting in May, even though we've doubled the number of vaccinated persons. But the number of new hospitalizations among the unvaccinated has dropped. Something about this isn't totally making sense to me. The percentage of people on May 3rd and the percentage of people on July 19th. On May 3rd, it's a very compelling story. The cases among the vaccinated was 7%. Among the unvaccinated, it was 93%. The hospitalizations among the vaccinated were 10%. The hospitalizations among the unvaccinated were 90%. But by July 19th, the cases among the vaccinated were 33%. They'd gone up. Among the unvaccinated, the cases had gone down to 67%. The hospitalizations had gone up among the vaccinated and down as a percentage among the unvaccinated. This is one of the very few studies we've found in the US that's giving us data on vaccination versus cases versus hospitalizations. And I have to say the numbers are confusing. We can definitely say overall that those who are vaccinated were a much smaller share of those cased and hospitalized than those unvaccinated. That much is very clear. It's also strange why those numbers seem to be shifting in a not so good direction as time goes on. Delta may be a part of that. There may be other factors we don't fully understand. Going back to the article published by the New York Times, wow, a little bit of care, a little bit of humility is a good thing, goes a long way, because we're certainly all in this together. And we hope to continue to explore this is something that we can do. Our friend Ken said, I think this needs a finer resolution to see this data by age group. And that's actually something I believe we can provide. I'm just going to see if we can bring that up. Looks like we can't immediately bring that up. What I will tell you from memory, from looking at those graphs, they do exist inside this report. We'll get that to you. You see, as we've always seen, among the higher age groups, much more pronounced effect for everything. And the vaccinations having a much bigger impact among those vulnerable populations to reduce their numbers, undeniably so, in those higher age groups. Also in the younger age groups, you're seeing differences of maybe like nearly zero, for example, hospitalizations in the, I think it was 18 to 49 age group among the vaccinated, and maybe 1 to 2 hospitalizations per 100,000 in the 18 to 49 age group among the unvaccinated. So again, you see the effect of the vaccines much more pronounced among those higher age groups. Undeniable in every category that the vaccine is reducing the cases, reducing the hospitalizations, effect much more pronounced among the higher age groups. But what's weird today is this dynamic, this dropping in efficacy while it appears the unvaccinated are dropping in count. So it's just very strange. I'll show you this too, also from CDC. I think what everyone's trying to wrestle with is vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization appears to be staying about the same. But the vaccine effectiveness, by various counts, dropping 70s, 60s, and lower against infection. The vaccines are losing their ability to stop infection, but sure seems like if you're vaccinated, you've got an even lower chance of being hospitalized than if you're not vaccinated. That currently seems to be what it's saying. We're not doctors. We don't even play ones on TV. We're not lawyers. We don't even play ones on TV. This is simply looking at the data through just eyes that want to kind of see what's there. But again, take this all with a grain of salt, just trying to dump data from the CDC. And speaking of data from the CDC, here's the nationwide community transmission by county, second major trough for the US, although as you saw New York Times reporting, it sounds like we may be coming out of that. You can actually see that at the right side of that graph. That's sort of trending upwards. Hate to put words in our mouths, but that may be coming upwards. That'd be really cool. Really cool, especially if we're going into fall, because we were expecting it, like the author of that article said, we were expecting that to jump up about now, not to be dropping off. COVID-19 admissions per 100 inpatient beds, it's really hard to make sense of a map other than by sort of gauging the quantity of red on it. But in recent weeks, we've been tracking that list to the right, which continues to drop. There's only one state left, Montana, it looks like, that is in the absolute dark red category. That's really good news. So it does sound like there's a trend in the right direction here nationwide. As we turn our attention to the state of Michigan, Michigan has never been redder. I don't think I've ever seen this graph for community transmission completely red. There's always been 1 or 2 outlier counties. This week, it's just completely solid red in what amounts to Michigan's, let's call it third major wave here since August of last year. The cases do continue to climb. The testing, the number of tests climbing back up towards levels we saw throughout the last year. As a result, the positivity rate's going to drop a little bit, but not much. It's kind of plateaued off here, so we'll see. Part of that little drop may have to do with the boost in the total number of tests, but the positivity rate hasn't plummeted yet, so looks like based on the transmission, we're still dealing with it here. The deaths, continuing to climb slightly. Thankfully, nowhere near the slopes you saw those first 3 times, but still continuing to inch up there. And the hospitalizations also much lower curve. Is this an effect of the vaccinations? It might be, because we see a damped surge. Is it a result of the naturally acquired immunity that seems to be taking places like New York down in their counts? It might be, but whatever else, we don't know. It is damped, and that's a good thing. It means the hospitals are getting hit less quickly, even though they do continue to fill. As with the previous waves, it looks like that 40 through 69-year-old demographic largely carrying it, one that I certainly fit into. And so our thoughts are with all those who have friends and family in the hospital systems, especially impacted by the staffing shortages, which just exacerbates the problem. In terms of vaccination doses administered, just slowly trending down here. The peak in August, the peak last March, April, but we'll see, that just seems to have plateaued at a relatively low level. And here's that graph we always talk about, and I've had the comment made, that graph doesn't do much for me. That's kind of the reason I think they have this front page of the CDC data. If the vaccines and everything else we were doing was stopping transmission, we would have a lot of nice light blue-green, but it's not. We've got a lot of top right corners there, and that's a sad thing to have to show, but I think that's why CDC put that out there. It's a very, very telling graphic, and they didn't hide it. They put it front and center, and sadly, we're not seeing the kind of results that we'd love to see in this, which would be top left corner, light green, light blue, but mostly heading in the dark red direction. So that is the data from the CDC that we track every week. Somewhat ambiguous. I think we all feel a little bit in the sloughs of waiting to see where this is going to come. But hopefully you're out there doing good things for the people around you, taking care of those around you, especially those vulnerable populations, doing what you can to take care of your fellow humans. And let's not get this cited. Let's just try to take care of each other. I'm glad you're here to go through these numbers. We try not to go through opinions, just the numbers from the CDC. And it's always good to see a little bit of hope on the national level with things dropping, even though it is the fall. Just in time for those cider and donuts that we've been talking about. We keep seeing the fall decorations coming out. And the questions keep rolling in. It is time for From the Mailbox. This is our second installment of what I think is going to become a regular here on the show. We love to talk about common MedTech questions. Startup questions, new product development questions, FDA questions, quality system questions. How do I do this? How do I do that? Because we run into these all the time with folks that we talk to. And then we realize, oh wait, you're about the fifth person to have asked that. Let's bring this to a wider audience. Maybe genericize it, take it out of the specifics, and talk about things that matter to companies engaged in new product development for MedTech. So last time we answered these three questions. You can go back and see that episode on YouTube if you want the answers to these questions. The first one was, my regulatory consultant looked at our medical device and told me that we are a Class 1 exempt product. This means we don't have to do anything for FDA except register and list, right? Well, we talked about that a little bit. Another one was Fitbit and Garmin are selling heart rate monitors as health and wellness devices, not medical devices. How do I tell FDA that I don't want my device to be considered a medical device? We talked about that, so go back and watch it on YouTube if you have an interest in that question. And thirdly, we talked about our team hasn't decided yet which technical approach to take for a part of the product, but I want to start on the FDA development process. But I don't want to start too early. When should I begin? And it turns out there's a hard and fast answer from FDA on that question. Talk to most consultants, they're going to tell you, well, you should start now. It's never too early. But that's not true, because getting started too early in a process that starts to lock you down throws away perfectly good sandbox that you can use to quickly maneuver, quickly pivot, be as efficient as you can with those investor dollars so that you can get to the answer more quickly. There does come a day where it's time to lock down. You need to understand when that day has come or is about to come. So You can find the answers to those on our YouTube page and hear the answers to those. A lot of good discussion last time around this. This week, we're going to start with this question. My last prototype, for those of you engaged in prototyping, didn't do everything I expected it to do. How do I get my next prototype to be market ready? Well, we've seen this happen many times, and many times folks will come to us for sort of project rescue because maybe they committed a prototype development to a company and they thought they were going to get back something market ready, and it wasn't. Major disappointment, major expectation let down. Maybe their internal team was working on it and the internal team said, yeah, we're almost there, we're almost there, we're almost there, and then it turns out they weren't. Happens all the time. How do you avoid this? Especially if you're a company leader or you're an engineering manager, you're an investor. How do you avoid this? I need my next prototype to be market ready. How do I do that? Well, let's talk about that. Here's the key. The primary remedy for this, the first thing we're going to talk about, it's really important, it's even necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I've seen in academic contexts when people teach development, when people teach product development, they'll start and end with this remedy, but they won't go beyond it. And so while it's important, while it's even necessary, it's not the whole story. In fact, today we're going to give 3 causes of not there yet prototyping. And the first one is incomplete requirements. If you don't have complete requirements, you're not done. You can't build a product without knowing what its requirements are. And so in many contexts, folk will say, make sure you give your development team a complete set of requirements. That's on you. And once you've done that, it's up to them. In reality, it's not actually that simple because you have things like dependent subsystems. We'll talk about that in a second. You also have insufficient iterations. Well, why should iterations be necessary if I gave you a perfectly complete set of requirements? Well, the answer is it's usually impossible to give a perfectly complete set of requirements the first time around. So let's talk about these incomplete requirements first of all. And here I want to start with this concept of test-driven development. When you think about requirements for a product, implicitly, you should be thinking about the test that's going to be accomplished to prove that you met that requirement. In the medical device industry, we often call those tests either verification or validation. But in any case, those go right back to requirements that are written about the product. Now, you can have valuable requirements or you can have worthless requirements. A requirement that just forced somebody to check a part number may have no value at all to the product development, safety, and efficacy of the product. But one that gets to the heart of what needs to happen, those are the valuable requirements. One that can be tested and the outcome of that test truly tells you, is this product doing what we want it to? Those are worthwhile requirements. So first of all, when you're thinking about requirements and the sufficiency of your requirements, think to yourself, could I test this? Is there a test that I could do today that would answer in a valuable way, a truly valuable way, whether the device was meeting these requirements? If you can think of that, then you're well on your way to writing good requirements. But here's the other problem, and this is why it's really hard to write a complete set of requirements at the outset of your company. You can't specify it until you see it. Sometimes we say that people don't know what they don't like until they see it. Everybody knows the importance of putting product into users' hands. And many times people are disappointed when the users don't respond the way they were hoping. But the silver lining to that is that they respond with information that tells you that one of your assumptions was wrong, or that you missed a requirement that you now know matters. And that's how the requirements for a product can grow into the correct set of requirements. This should give you a little hint that iterations are necessary. You can come up with the most beautiful requirements list in the world, but for some level of wrongness, it's gonna be wrong. What matters is that you provide the ability to iterate so that you can find out which requirements were right, which were wrong, and which were missing that you didn't even know about. This is massively overlooked in product development. In many cases, even in the world of startups, we talk about failing fast, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute as well. This is an opportunity for that whole fail fast concept to be applied. It's also a result, incomplete requirements are also a result of an incomplete knowledge of the domain. If you don't fully understand the domain you're operating in, maybe you're not a manufacturing expert in the domain you're entering. Maybe you're not a design expert in the domain you're entering. Maybe you're not a clinical expert in the domain you're entering. We'll often try to fill these holes from a business perspective when it comes to marketing and other things like that, or finance. But sometimes those holes aren't filled quickly with respect to development topics. Do you have a team who can cover all of those bases? You never have it perfectly at the outset, but that can grow over time through trusted employees and partners. And as you do that, your knowledge of the domain will increase. And as the knowledge of the domain increases, you'll start to realize those requirements that you got right, the requirements you got wrong, and the requirements that were missing. And it's those missing requirements that have always got a hold of you at the outset and that you're trying to fight back against as you win that product development battle. Well, let's talk about this too. It's not just a matter of not knowing all of the requirements at the outset. It's also the challenge of dependent subsystems. Very few products are so simple that they just constitute, for example, one piece of plastic. If they do, great, congratulations, you have a much simpler product development process. But as overlapping subsystems that rely on each other have to work together in harmony, it makes no sense to integrate those at step one. And many times a company will try to specify to its product development team, the next iteration has to meet all of these goals. And the team churns and churns and churns for months and years because they're chasing variables that are moving in relation to each other. What do? You separate them. It's just like solving equations for those of you who still like math. Separate them until you're down to one variable each. Solve those. Those are subsystem test beds. They allow you to fix those variables. It requires iterations, but it's much, much more efficient than trying to chase variables as they all change on the plate in front of you. And we've seen that happen so many times with companies that come to us. They're trying to chase everything at once, when really they just have to identify what those targets are that are the highest risk and knock them out of the way so that then they can integrate and get on with their product development life. Integration before basic functionality is a recipe for disaster. If you're dealing with a product and it feels like you're chasing your tail, ask yourself, could this be what's going on? Do we need to break this down? Do we need to allow for one more iteration in this development? Because frequently we find that that's exactly the case. Cynefin. What? Well, you've heard us talk about this on the show before, but I thought it's important to bring this back in at this point. It's a Welsh word applied in this case by a man named Dave Snowden. We didn't come up with this, but we love to tell folks about it. The Cynefin framework for problem solving and sense making was created by Dave Snowden. This particularly fun graphic was created by Martin Berg. You can find Dave Snowden's work at cognitive-edge.com, the Cynefin framework. We take no credit for it or for this awesome graphic by Martin Berg. But what it does is to observe that problem solving falls into at least 4 domains. And product development is problem solving. It can fall into the complex domain where we have unknowns. It can fall into the chaotic domain where things are basically unknowable. Good luck ever sorting it out. It can fall into the complicated domain where things are knowable but unfamiliar. It's going to take some work. Or the clear domain where things are known and familiar. Failing to place the elements of your product development into this framework correctly can lead to a lot of heartache. For example, we've seen teams that were trying to redevelop the wheel, reinventing electronics that already can be bought off the shelf in a day and spending months doing it. They were treating a clear part of the problem as something that was complex or complicated, much to the delay of their project. But we've also seen teams that are treating elements as clear, known, expecting that things are real easy to do, when in fact, maybe they're knowable, but they're unfamiliar. The team is going to take time to work through that, to develop it. So again, a framework like Cynefin helps teams to put things in their proper place, to identify what is easy to solve and what's going to need more time. And again, you can make the mistake in 2 ways: redeveloping the wheel or thinking something is really, really easy when it's really not. And that's where experience comes in. But if you're not pursuing a process like that in your product development, strongly encourage you to do so as you're trying to come up even with your requirements for the product. And this on iterations. An iteration is there to be the minimum needed to get more information. If you spend one more day working on something that's going to be torn out and thrown away, you've wasted your time. And this is a roadblock between you and your market-ready product. If you try to shove everything in there only to have to rip out half of it, that wasn't worth the time putting it in. Only put enough into the next iteration to be able to show you what you didn't know, to be able to prove that what you thought you did know was true. Keep it to the minimum. In disciplines like software, folks understand this with things like Agile and other types of development processes. We often don't think about this in the medical product development space. So make those iterations the minimum needed to get more information. And fail fast. I don't really mean fail, it's not a failure. But you need to find the places where your requirements and assumptions and potential solutions are wrong. There's no shame in that. Well, unless you're one day before the clinical trials need to start and then you find out. That's a shame. So fail fast. Bring that in early and then make those iterations. Also, create now and later lists. Many is the company that set out and a director of product development said, oh, I'm going to toss the entire list over the wall to my development team, whether internal or external. When what they really should have done was work with that team and identify what iteration is needed now. But don't forget what's needed later. We have to keep it in mind. We have to target it because it needs to get done. You may be realizing now, this requires an architecture, not just of your product, but of the development process itself. It's not sufficient to simply say, here's our best guess at the list of requirements. Are you done yet? It requires architecting the development process, creating iterations that allow you to fail fast, to identify the unknown unknowns and find answers to the known unknowns so that you can get as quickly as possible to your final solution, which is your product. It's there to meet the requirements. It's there to meet the standards. It's there to meet the user needs, and it's ultimately there to fulfill the intended use for which you're offering it to the market. So hopefully that helps. Really common problem, something that people run into all the time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. You can type them in the chat box. You can raise your hand as well. We're more than happy to answer them. I'm going to move on to the next question for today. And we had a version of this just recently. I've heard that my manufacturer needs to be FDA certified for me to use them for medical device manufacturing. Is this true? Well, this is an interesting question. The answer is no. And kind of. Okay, so what's the explanation of this? On the no side of this question, here's what it is on the no side of the question. The FDA simply does not certify manufacturers. Well, outside of some pilot programs, there is a software pre-certification that they're working on, and there's something called CMMA, which is under exploration. But in general, as a rule, FDA certifies no one. The best that a manufacturer can say is that they've been audited by the FDA. And if they can say that, I would wake up and pay attention. Because being audited by the FDA means you know how to meet their challenges. And if you didn't get too many findings, well, I think you should be pretty proud of that. But that's still not a requirement at this point. In fact, thinking about your manufacturer having some FDA certification is kind of missing the point, and it often overlooks your own responsibility. And what do I mean by this? If we look at 21 CFR Part 820, which is the quality system regulation for FDA, applies to all device companies. When we look at that, you're going to find general provisions, quality system requirements, as well as records. Let me clarify something I just said. There are companies that are not subject to 21 CFR 820. We should say it is potentially applicable to all companies. These are the subparts that if 21 CFR 820 applies to you, you're not going to escape. They are your responsibility. They are your company's responsibility. At minimum, you're going to have a quality manual that addresses these and works with these. Now, if you work with an outside developer, for example, Into Being, we're going to help you with things like design controls and document controls, so you don't have to worry so much about them. But the ultimate responsibility for those still falls at your company's feet. You have to understand how your developers' systems and your systems work together, how their processes and your processes work together, so that you can ultimately take responsibility for that. They can educate, they can guide, they can provide procedures, but they can never take away the ultimate responsibility of compliance. In the same way, the rest of 820, your manufacturing partner can certainly help with. They can provide procedures, they can provide expertise, they can provide record keeping and compliance. They may have to sustain an audit by the agency. But this doesn't mean that they've taken all the responsibility away from you. It's up to you to understand your responsibilities and how they dovetail with your manufacturer's responsibilities. How you transfer that responsibility through things like contracting and purchasing agreements. How you need to audit them to make sure they're doing the right thing for you. Now, in the sense of maybe or sometimes, it is true that every manufacturer of medical devices, whether they're the specification developer or not, will have to register and list with the FDA. So it's true that your manufacturer probably will or should have already registered and listed with the agency. That is true, but it's not sufficient. It's not the whole story. And so while it can be helpful to find a registered and listed medical device manufacturer, it can be very helpful to have one who's already experienced in running quality systems. It is not sufficient because your company at the top is responsible for fielding that first audit from FDA. When they walk through the door, you're going to be the one they're talking to. So make sure you understand how your development activities and how your manufacturing activities play into that. Where can your partners help you? And where is it fundamentally your responsibility first off? There are lots of questions around this. We've just scratched the surface. So feel free to bring that up in any questions that you have for us. And with that, I want to just remind you about the $2,500 quarterly MedTech Crossroads pitch party. We just got done with the last iteration of that for Q3. We're still working on the time and date of the next pitch party judging, but in the next handful of months, we'll be starting that back up again. So right now, we are accepting contestants for the MedTech Crossroads pitch party, US-based MedTech startups eligible for consideration. I'm personally partial to the ones that come from Michigan, but we don't participate in the judging, and we've had winners from both in and outside the state. Every participant gets 10 minutes at the end of a show to put their pitch out. You can send the deck to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org to be eligible for selection, and your materials need to cover the areas of problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, competitors, and your ask, or the functionally equivalent areas. So send those along. I think often folks are surprised. They think there's some catch, and in fact, we're really just here trying to boost local startups, give them another chance to pitch a very low burden one, and one that comes with some real cash at the end. So send those startups along. We would love to involve them in the pitch party. Our judges, as always, Andy Rader, Managing Partner of Evergreen M&A Partners, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, a vascular surgeon and founder of ArborHive, Jim Metzger, the President of Keystone Solutions Group, and Stacy Frankovich, the Program Manager of MedHealth. All wonderful folks in our community with their own unique talents and gifts that they have to offer to the community. And we have been honored to have them judging for us. And we'll look forward to the next time they are on doing that for the next round of pitch party contestants. So with that, I think we are to the end of the materials we wanted to cover today from the mailbox. Always fun. We're going to give a few seconds to see if anyone has any questions for us today. I think we have answered the question about finer resolution on data. We're going to give just a few minutes. The other thing we always give time at the end of a show for is to see if anyone has any announcements. Sometimes you're running a program. You're looking for companies to chat with. You want people to know about something you want them to get part of. Let us know. We're always happy to announce that. There's no burden on that. We're just always happy to put that in and talk about it. But not seeing any hands raised or anything in the Q&A, I want to thank you for being here today on MedTech Crossroads. We'll look forward to next week, and we've got fun shows coming up in the future. We'll look forward to having you. Thanks for being here on episode 78. We'll talk soon. Enjoy your fall. Bye-bye.